Here's the full merged script, combining everything into one continuous piece, researched from the 2021 Tripartite Origin Study and the 2022 Gaia Tomb Genome Study, plus supporting research on the Ainu, Ryukyu Islands, and the 2024 Doigahama genome, September 17, 2021. In the journal Science Advances, a team of geneticists, led by Shigeki Nakagome at Trinity College Dublin, published the results of 12 newly sequenced ancient Japanese genomes, and in doing so, they quietly dismantled a story about Japanese origins that had stood largely unchallenged for decades. For generations, the accepted narrative taught in Japanese schools and repeated in textbooks around the world held that the Japanese people descended from just two ancestral populations, blending together in a relatively simple two-step process. The new genetic evidence revealed something considerably stranger. Not two ancestral populations, but three. And the third one arrived far later than anyone expected, sweeping into Japan during the exact period the country's imperial system itself was being born, leaving a genetic signature so unexpected that the researchers themselves called it, in their own published paper, unexpected. To understand why this finding actually matters, you first need to understand the story it replaced. For decades, the dominant scientific model of Japanese ancestry was what researchers called the dual structure hypothesis, positing that mainland Japanese populations descended from exactly two sourcey populations: the Jomon, an indigenous population of hunter-gatherer fishers who had inhabited the Japanese archipelago for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, and the Yayoi, farmers who migrated into Japan from the Asian continent and introduced wet rice agriculture. According to the study's own published findings, the Jomon people occupied the Japanese archipelago from around 16,000 years ago all the way through roughly 3,000 years ago, an almost unbroken stretch of 13,000 years of continuous habitation before the Yayoi arrived from the continent and lived alongside, and eventually intermixed with, the descendants of these same original inhabitants, beginning around 900 BC and continuing through roughly 300 AD. The genetic story of the Jomon themselves, once modern sequencing technology was finally applied to their remains, turned out to be genuinely remarkable on its own, entirely apart from anything involving later population mixing. According to the study's own findings, the Jomon maintained an extraordinarily small effective population size, hovering around just 1,000 individuals, sustained continuously across several thousand years of isolation. Their genetic divergence from mainland continental populations traces back to somewhere between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, a period that coincides precisely with rising sea levels, physically isolating the Japanese archipelago from the Asian mainland, cutting off what had previously been a connected landmass and trapping this founding population on its own, evolving in relative genetic isolation for millennia while sea levels rose around them. When the Yayoi migration eventually did arrive, bringing wet rice cultivation and an entirely different subsistence strategy and way of life, the genetic evidence reveals something that actually contradicts a common assumption about how agricultural transitions typically unfold in prehistoric populations. According to the study's own conclusions, researchers found genetic evidence that this agricultural transition in prehistoric Japan involved a process of assimilation rather than replacement, with almost equal genetic contributions from both the indigenous Jomon population and the newly arrived farmers associated with wet rice cultivation. That's a meaningfully different outcome than what happens in many other documented agricultural transitions around the world, where incoming farming populations frequently and dramatically outnumber and genetically swamp existing hunter-gatherer populations. In Japan, the genetic record instead points to something closer to a genuine, roughly balanced merger between two very different populations and ways of life. That two-part story, Jomon and Yayoi combining in relatively balanced proportions, is exactly what Japanese textbooks have taught for decades. What the 2021 study actually revealed, and what makes this genuinely a not who we thought story, is what happened next, centuries later, during a period called the Kofun era. According to the researchers' own findings, they identified a later entirely unexpected influx of additional East Asian ancestry arriving during the imperial Kofun period, which lasted from roughly 300 to 700 AD, precisely the era that saw the emergence of political centralization in Japan and the beginning of what would eventually become the imperial system that continues in some form to this day. Professor Nakagome himself described the significance of this finding plainly. Researchers had been learning more and more about the cultures of the Jomon, Yayoi, and Kofun periods as archaeological artifacts kept emerging. But before this genetic study, scientists knew relatively little about the actual genetic origins and impact of both the earlier agricultural transition and this later, considerably more mysterious state formation phase. This third genetic wave wasn't simply a minor demographic ripple either. The study's own abstract states the conclusion directly. These three ancestral components, Jomon, Yayoi, and this later Kofun period influx, continue to characterize present-day Japanese populations today, supporting what the researchers formally named a tripartite model of Japanese genomic origins, replacing the simpler dual structure hypothesis that had dominated the field for decades. Modern Japanese people, according to this genetic evidence, don't simply carry a blend of two ancestral populations. They carry a genetically detectable signature of three separate, chronologically distinct waves of ancestry, the last of which arrived considerably more recently and considerably more mysteriously than either of the two earlier, better understood populations. And here's where the story stops being purely about Japan in isolation and becomes genuinely deeply entangled with the history of the Korean Peninsula as well. The research team's own findings point directly toward where this mysterious third wave most likely originated. According to their published conclusions, several lines of archaeological evidence support the introduction of new large settlements to Japan, most likely arriving from the southern Korean peninsula, occurring specifically during this Yayoi to Kofun transition period. The analyses provide strong support for genuine genetic exchange accompanying the appearance of entirely new social, cultural, and political traits during this exact state formation phase, precisely the period when Japan's imperial system itself was taking shape. In other words, the genetic ancestry most directly connected to the birth of Japan's imperial state doesn't trace back to some isolated, purely indigenous Japanese source at all. It traces back, at least in significant part, to population movement out of the Korean Peninsula. That single finding alone should already complicate any simplified nationalist narrative of a purely self-contained, ethnically isolated Japanese origin story. But the genetic story runs even deeper and even more entangled once you turn the lens around and look at what ancient DNA has revealed about Korea's own population history. Because it turns out the connection between these two populations doesn't just run in one direction, from Korea into Japan during the Kofun period. It runs the other way as well, and it runs considerably further back in time. In 2022, a separate team of researchers, led by Per Gelabert of the University of Vienna, working alongside colleagues in South Korea, Portugal, and the United States, published the very first paleogenomic data ever recovered from Korea's Three Kingdoms period in the journal Current Biology. The team successfully sequenced 8 ancient genomes dated to roughly the 4th and 5th centuries CE, recovered from 2 archaeological sites in Gimhae, South Korea, 7 samples from Daesungdong, the iconic royal funerary complex belonging to the Gaya Confederacy, a political entity that existed alongside, though distinct from, Korea's more famous 3 kingdoms of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, and 1 additional sample from a child buried at a more modest site called the Yuhari Shell Mound. These weren't randomly selected skeletons either. Of the 8 individuals studied, some had been identified through archaeological context as actual tomb owners. High-status individuals afforded elaborate burial, while others were identified as human sacrifices, buried alongside those same tomb owners as part of the same funerary ritual. What the researchers found when they compared the genetic profiles of these tomb owners against the sacrificed individuals buried alongside them produced a genuinely striking result. According to Gelabert's own statement accompanying the study's publication, the individual genetic differences observed among these 8 people were not correlated with grave typology at all, meaning there was no detectable genetic distinction separating the high-status tomb owners from the people sacrificed to accompany them in death. We have observed that there is no clear genetic difference between the grave owners and the human sacrifices, Gelabert said, indicating that social status in Three Kingdoms period Korea was not determined by genetic ancestry, but by a social and political hierarchy rather than a biological one. It's the broader ancestral composition of these 8 ancient Korean individuals that connects directly back to the Japanese genetic story and delivers the single most genuinely surprising finding of the entire study. All 8 individuals were best modeled genetically as an admixture between 2 specific ancestral sources, a Bronze Age genetic component originating from northern China, and, remarkably, ancestry related to the Jomon population, the same indigenous hunter-gatherer population that had spent thousands of years isolated on the Japanese archipelago, sharing genetic similarities with present-day populations from Japan rather than Korea. Ancient Koreans, living in the heart of the Gaya Confederacy 1,500 years ago, carried real, measurable, genetically detectable ancestry, connected to the same indigenous population that helped found the Japanese people on the other side of the sea. The scale of that Jomon-related ancestry, once researchers dug into earlier, Korean genetic samples predating even these Three Kingdoms period individuals became even more dramatic. Ancient Korean samples recovered from a site called Yokshi-do, located on Korea's southern coast and dated to roughly 6,000 years old, showed a genuinely staggering 95% Jomon-related ancestry. An ancient Korean population, thousands of years before the Gaia Confederacy even existed, that was overwhelmingly genetically dominated by the exact same ancestral component that, separately, independently, helped found the population of Japan. Here's the detail that transforms this from a simple, interesting historical footnote into something genuinely disturbing to anyone invested in a clean, separate, ethnically distinct national origin story for either country. This shared ancestral thread has since almost completely vanished from the genetic makeup of modern populations on both sides of the strait, in strikingly different ways. On the Korean side, modern Koreans appear to have lost this Jomon-related genetic component entirely, a consequence of what researchers describe as a period of relative genetic isolation that followed the Three Kingdoms period, during which the population of the Korean peninsula intermixed internally, gradually diminishing the genetic differences and regional diversity that had existed among earlier, more heterogeneous populations like the one buried in Gaia's royal tombs, until Koreans eventually became the comparatively genetically homogeneous population recognized today. The ancient Gaia Confederacy was genetically more diverse than the present-day Korean population. On the Japanese side, the story runs differently, but arrives at an equally striking conclusion. Kofun period genomes point toward a notable dilution of Jomon-related ancestry occurring in both regions, Korea and Japan, during roughly the same 4th to 7th century window. In Japan's case, this dilution corresponds directly to that mysterious third ancestral wave identified in the tripartite. Origin study, the wave of new East Asian ancestry, likely originating from the Korean peninsula, that arrived precisely during the Kofun state formation period. There's one more genome that belongs at the center of this story because it delivers the single most direct, most specific piece of evidence connecting ancient Korea and ancient Japan, and it comes from a burial site most people have never heard of. Doigahama in Yamaguchi Prefecture, on the western tip of Japan's main island, facing directly across the water toward the Korean peninsula. In 2024, a team of Japanese researchers finally sequenced the complete nuclear genome of a Yayoi period individual recovered from this exact site. And what they found sharpened the entire Korea-Japan genetic connection into something considerably more precise. This Yayoi individual, much like the later Kofun period people and modern mainland Japanese populations, carried three genetically distinct ancestral components: Jomon-related ancestry, a broader East Asian-related component, and a northeastern Siberian-related genetic thread as well. The most striking finding came from comparing this ancient Japanese individual against a wide range of other ancient and modern populations, specifically to determine which living or ancient population he was genetically closest to. Among all non-Japanese populations examined, the Korean population showed the highest degree of genetic similarity to this Yayoi individual buried on Japanese soil. When the researchers ran their formal admixture modeling, the model that fit best across Yayoi, Kofun, and modern Japanese people alike was a straightforward two-way mixture: Jomon-related ancestry combined with Korean-related ancestry. The study's own stated conclusion: between the Yayoi and Kofun periods, the majority of immigrants arriving in the Japanese archipelago most likely originated primarily from the Korean peninsula, not simply from some vague, undifferentiated continental East Asia, as earlier, less precise genetic models had suggested. There's an important geographic wrinkle to this whole story worth understanding too, because the Jomon-Yayoi-Kofun genetic mixture isn't evenly distributed across every corner of modern Japan today. Jomon-related autosomal DNA persisted at meaningfully higher levels, specifically in two regions: Hokkaido, the country's northernmost main island, and the Ryukyu Islands, the chain of subtropical islands stretching south from Kyushu toward Taiwan, including Okinawa. In the Ryukyu Islands, researchers have documented Jomon admixture at roughly 27%, considerably higher than the level found among mainland Japanese populations. Among the Ainu people, the indigenous population of Hokkaido, Jomon ancestry may run as high as 79%, by far the highest concentration of this ancient indigenous ancestral component found anywhere in the modern Japanese archipelago. Even the Ainu, though, aren't a perfectly pure, unmixed proxy for the original Jomon population. The Ainu population most likely formed through an initial mixing of Hokkaido's own Jomon population with a separate Siberian population, most likely connected to what's known as the Okhotsk culture, before subsequently mixing further with mainland Japanese populations, through which the Ainu ultimately acquired an additional layer of Yayoi-related DNA as well. Even the population most closely associated with preserving ancient Jomon heritage in Japan today carries its own layered history of repeated, separate admixture events. There's a genuinely fascinating pattern buried in how this ancient mixing actually played out at the level of biological sex, one that researchers have identified as a recurring theme, not just in Japan, but across multiple entirely separate agricultural transitions studied around the world. The specific Y chromosome lineage most strongly associated with Jomon ancestry, a paternal haplogroup called DM55, has remained present in the Japanese population continuously since the very first inhabitants arrived on the archipelago, without ever being fully extinguished, even after thousands of years of subsequent mixing with Yayoi farmers and Kofun period immigrants. It would appear that Jomon males were very successfully assimilated into the incoming agricultural Yayoi population, a dynamic that is definitely not unique or exclusive to Japan, with strikingly similar patterns documented separately in both European and Oceanian population history, where incoming farming populations repeatedly absorbed local hunter-gatherer populations, and specifically hunter-gatherer men, into their communities. The overall autosomal genetic contribution from the original hunter-gatherer population often ends up comparatively modest, while their Y chromosome lineages, traced purely through the male line, persist at relatively high frequencies anyway, evidence of male-biased gene flow, indigenous hunter-gatherer men having children with incoming farmer women at meaningfully higher rates than the reverse. Even within Japan's own island chains, the genetic picture turns out to be considerably more fragmented and locally variable than a single unified national story can really capture. A detailed genomic study focused specifically on the southern Ryukyu Islands found something that complicates even the broader tripartite model itself. When scientists analyzed ancient individuals from a specific site called Nagabaka, they found this population couldn't be successfully modeled as descending from any single ancestral source at all, formally ruling out the idea that these particular islanders were simply the direct, unmixed descendants of the Jomon population, the assumption many researchers had previously held about the Ryukyu Islands generally. These Nagabaka individuals showed a genetic profile distinct even from other historic and Kofun period populations elsewhere in Japan, suggesting that the exact composition and timing of ancestral mixing genuinely varied from region to region, island to island, rather than following one single uniform national pattern across the entire Japanese archipelago. Pull every one of these threads together, the original tripartite Jomon Yayoi Kofun model, the direct genetic link between Yayoi period Japan and the Korean Peninsula revealed by the Doigahama genome, the 95% Jomon related ancestry found in 6,000-year-old Korean remains at Yokchi-do, the genetically indistinguishable tomb owners and sacrificial victims of the Gaia Confederacy, the elevated Jomon ancestry preserved in Hokkaido's Ainu and the Ryukyu Islands, the male-biased pattern of hunter-gatherer assimilation into incoming farmer populations, and the further genetic fragmentation revealed even within Japan's own southern island chain, and you get a population history that resists almost every simple, singular origin story anyone might want to tell about either Japan or Korea. There was no single unified moment when the Japanese, or the Koreans, simply came into existence as clean, separate, self-contained peoples. There were, instead, repeated waves of migration, assimilation, and mixing, stretching across thousands of years, weaving genetic threads back and forth across the Korea Strait in multiple directions, at multiple points in time, an ancient Korean population once overwhelmingly carrying the same ancestry that helped found Japan, and a later wave moving the opposite direction to help forge Japan's own imperial state, each population subsequently losing, diluting, or reshaping different pieces of that shared inheritance over the centuries that followed, until each arrived at the more genetically distinct, more separately identifiable modern populations recognized today. The genetic evidence doesn't support a story of pure, isolated, independently originating peoples on either side of the strait. It supports a story of deep, repeated entanglement, followed by centuries of separate demographic drift that gradually obscured, without ever fully erasing, just how intertwined to everything covered so far comes from genomes pulled directly out of the ground, statistical models built from bone and tooth samples thousands of years old. But there's a remarkable point where this same Korea-Japan genetic entanglement stops being purely prehistoric and steps directly into the written historical record, confirmed not by archaeologists digging up skeletons, but by an actual reigning monarch speaking on the record in the year 2001. The story starts with Baekje, one of Korea's three kingdoms, ruling the southwestern portion of the peninsula from 18 BCE to 1660 CE, alongside its rivals Goguryeo and Silla. According to the World History Encyclopedia's detailed account of Korean-Japanese relations during this period, the connection between Baekje and the Yamato state in Japan went well beyond simple trade or diplomacy. Korean chronicles, specifically the Samguk Sagi and Samguk Yusa, describe Baekje royalty and nobility serving as genuinely influential figures within the Wa court, Japan's ruling structure at the time, and Baekje worked actively to maintain its alliance with Yamato Japan across generations. That relationship went beyond mere trade in a very literal military sense, too. In the year 400 CE, a joint Baekje-Gayawa military force actually launched a combined attack against the rival Korean kingdom of Silla, an attack that was ultimately rebuffed by an army sent by the famous Goguryeo king Gwanggaeto the Great. Korea's three kingdoms and Japan's Yamato state weren't distant, occasionally trading neighbors. They were entangled enough in each other's internal political and military affairs to fight actual coordinated wars together. The clearest, most personally documented thread connecting these two royal houses runs directly through a specific Baekje king named Muryong, who ruled from 501 to 523 CE. According to the New World Encyclopedia's account, scholars maintain that Muryong of Baekje, the kingdom's 25th king, was actually born in Japan itself, a detail confirmed across multiple historical sources examining his life. His own tomb, discovered in 1971 in Gongju, South Korea, and now recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, yielded genuinely extraordinary funerary treasures. Gold diadem ornaments, gold belts, gold earrings, a silver wine cup, and an epitaph plaque recording his own name, all preserved well enough to transform historical understanding of Baekje. Culture almost overnight, since so little concrete archaeological evidence of this specific kingdom had survived compared to its better documented rivals. Muryong's own family connections to Japan didn't end with his birthplace either. According to Wikipedia's detailed account of his lineage, his own relative, Prince Junda, known in Baekje as Buyo Junta, settled permanently in Japan and became the direct ancestor of the Yamato no Fuhito clan, an entire noble Japanese family line tracing its own origins straight back to Baekje royalty. A separate son of the same Baekje royal family, Shigakishi, was sent to Japan in 505 CE, specifically as a political hostage to Emperor Buretsu, a diplomatic practice common across the ancient world, where royal family members were exchanged between allied states, essentially as living guarantees of continued cooperation and loyalty. But it's what happened generations later, connecting this same Baekje bloodline directly into the still reigning Japanese imperial family, that turns this story from interesting ancient history into something genuinely startling in a modern political context. According to Wikipedia's account, Japanese historical records, specifically the Shoku Nihongi, identify Takano no Nigasa, the birthmother of Japan's Emperor Kamu, who reigned in the late 8th century, as belonging directly to the lineage of King Muryong of Baekje. Now that's not some distant symbolic cultural connection. That's a documented genealogical claim recorded in Japan's own official historical chronicles, tracing a direct maternal bloodline from a Korean king straight into the ancestry of a reigning Japanese emperor, and by extension, into the ancestry of the entire unbroken imperial line that continues on the chrysanthemum throne to this day. For centuries, that specific genealogical connection remained a matter of historical record, debated among scholars, occasionally politically sensitive given the fraught, often painful history between Korea and Japan across the 20th century, but never formally, publicly acknowledged by the Japanese imperial family itself. That changed in December of 2001. According to Wikipedia's account, Japan's Emperor Akihito, addressing reporters directly, made a statement no Japanese emperor had ever made publicly before. I, on my part, feel a certain kinship with Korea, given that it is recorded in the chronicles of Japan that the mother of Emperor Kanmu was one of the descendants of King Muryong of Baekje. It was, according to that same source, the first time a Japanese emperor had ever publicly acknowledged Korean blood running through the imperial line, a genuinely significant statement given the immense cultural and political weight Japan's imperial institution carries, both domestically and in its historically fraught relationship with Korea. This entire historical episode adds a real, documented, textually confirmed layer directly on top of everything the ancient DNA evidence has already established. The genetic record shows deep, repeated, prehistoric entanglement between the populations of the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese Archipelago, stretching back thousands of years before either country's written history even begins. The written historical record then shows that same entanglement continuing directly into the documented, named, individually identifiable royal families of both nations, right up through a Baekje king born in Japan, his relatives founding noble Japanese clans, and finally, his own descendant becoming the mother of a reigning Japanese emperor. A bloodline connection an actual 20th century Japanese monarch felt moved to publicly acknowledge. there's one more thread worth pulling into this picture, because it extends the story of shared ancestry back to something even more fundamental than royal bloodlines: the origin of rice farming itself, the exact agricultural transition that originally brought the Yayoi population into Japan in the first place. According to research referenced by Heritage of Japan, examining the deep roots of the Yayoi migration, DNA testing has revealed genetic similarities connecting Japan's earliest wet rice farmers back to populations from the lower basin of China's Yangtze River, the region where rice cultivation was first domesticated. That same broader research notes that rice technology and farming populations then spread north into the Korean Peninsula before ultimately reaching Japan, meaning the entire agricultural revolution that transformed Japan and eventually gave rise to the Yayoi. Population whose genetic legacy still runs through every modern Japanese person today didn't originate on the Korean Peninsula or the Japanese archipelago at all. It originated further west, in China, and moved through Korea as an intermediate step on its way toward Japan, adding yet another layer to the broader, tangled migratory history already established through the genetic evidence, and reinforcing exactly the same core lesson this deep genetic and now historical record keeps repeating. Neither Korea's nor Japan's ancient population history unfolded in isolation. Both nations' deepest roots, agricultural, genetic, and eventually even royal and dynastic, were woven together and woven outward toward the broader Asian continent across thousands of years, long before either country's modern national identity or the political tensions that have sometimes accompanied it had any reason to exist at all. These two populations' deep ancestral roots actually are.